Welcome to Feminine Roadmap Podcast. I'm your host, Gina Farrar. Each week, I bring you an inspiring conversation to help you navigate the challenges and changes of midlife so that you can not only survive, but thrive in your second half. Today on Feminine Roadmap, we are going to be talking about rediscovering yourself after a stroke. Because after someone suffers a stroke, while it's important that they work hard at physical therapies, losing capabilities can be difficult and affect identities. We are going to be talking about how to grapple with that change emotionally. Please stay tuned. Hello, Feminine Roadmappers. It is Gina here, and we have a little bit different of a podcast format this morning. I'm excited to introduce to you my guest today, Debra Meyerson. She's a former Sanford professor. She has suffered a stroke. She struggles from aphasia, which creates a communication challenge. So we are going to be sharing this interview with her husband, Steve Zuckerman. And so together we are going to be sharing their journey about identity theft, rediscovering ourselves after stroke. Debra wrote this book with her son, Danny. So today I want to share with you their story, their message of what it's like to have your identity shifted with a health challenge like stroke. So without further ado, I would like to welcome Debra and Steve to the show. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for being here.
Thank you.
My pleasure. So as I introduced the podcast, we are having a different conversation because Debra, you have aphasia from your stroke, and so your communication is more challenging than it was before your stroke. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And so we have Steve here with us to help really facilitate the conversation so that we make sure that your message comes through really clearly. So I want to thank you both for coming on together and sharing this with us.
Thanks for having us.
Yes, absolutely. So why don't we start just a little bit about your stroke story? When did this happen and what brought it on?
9 years ago, Labor Day weekend, I am, Steve and I and Danny and Sarah are going to Tahoe to a hike, and I am really, my leg is really feeling bad.
It was actually, as we were getting in the car to go up to the mountains, Debs, and she describes this in the book, her leg just felt weird. It didn't hurt. It just felt weird. And Deb's stroke was a little unusual in that it really took almost a day and a half for those symptoms to get serious enough for us to realize that something was happening and ultimately that it was a stroke. So it was a little bit of a slow fall off a cliff for her, not the kind of immediate stroke event that affects a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now, what kind of stroke was this? Are there different kinds of strokes that happen?
The ischemic stroke.
Yeah, so the most common kind of stroke is an ischemic stroke, which means it's a blockage of blood flow to the brain. And less common, about 15%, are what they call hemorrhagic strokes, which are a bleed that in both cases it kills brain cells. In one case, the brain cells are starved of oxygen because there's no blood. And in the other case, they're drowned because of the inappropriate flow of blood. And Deb's was the more common kind, although, and she'll tell me not to get into pretending to be a doctor, but hers was an unusual ischemic stroke in that most ischemic strokes are caused by a blood clot, whereas hers was caused by an actual tear in the wall of an artery that then the flap blocked the blood flow. So a little bit different.
Interesting. So when did this happen?
9 years ago today.
Labor Day, yeah. So Labor Day 2010.
Yeah.
2010. Okay. So what happened in your journey at that point? You take her to the hospital, obviously. Did you go to emergency or did you go to the hospital? And what were the next things that happened in your life?
And I have, I don't, I am fine. I am fine.
So at first, Deb thought she was fine. She didn't even sort of acknowledge that anything was wrong. And again, just one of the things about the book, Identity Theft, Rediscovering Ourselves After Stroke, is that it's not just Deb's story. Deb really wanted to present a lot of different people's journeys. So she, with the help of somebody we hired to help her, a woman named Sally Collings, interviewed 25 other survivors, caregivers, doctors, family members, to really try to get a sense of the diversity of experience.
Mm-hmm.
And in Deb's case, she really remembers very little of the first 3 or 4 days after the stroke. Obviously, she kind of knows the story now because we tell it. But in her case, we had to get from Tahoe down back to the Bay Area, so it was complicated. I think what's most significant was that initially her damage was very severe. She lost all speech. She literally, no sound would come out of her mouth, and the right side of her body was almost completely paralyzed. She barely had a twitch of activity in her leg. So fortunately, they were able to stabilize the medical condition. I mean, that was scary in and of itself because it wasn't obvious that she'd survived the stroke. But having gotten through that, she then had to start, and we had to start from a place of just a complete life change, total, again, at the beginning, total disability, total dependence, etc.
Initially, how did that affect your family emotionally? What was the instant impact of that?
And my son, Danny Zuckerman, Stephen and Danny are Reno Hospital, and Danny is really central to the
Yeah, Deb's referring, one of the chapters of the book is Stroke is a Family Disease, and we talk about the impact on the whole family. And one of the most profound immediate impacts was our son Danny, who then was 21, just about to go into his senior year of college, really jumped in as my adult partner dealing with a crisis. So I think, when you talk about family dynamics, one of the ones that changed immediately was our relationship as father and son to really becoming partner in crisis management was a pretty big impact. But I think that, with respect to Deb's disabilities, a lot of, and this is not uncommon, many of the people Deb interviewed felt this way. A big part of the early experience was kind of denial.
Yes.
That, and we had an expression which was, someday we're going to look back on this and it's just going to be a 1-year blip.
Yeah.
So we had a little bit of denial, a lot of optimism that, with hard work, she'd recover, she'd go back to life as it was. And really, for the 1-year blip line became the 2-year blip line, became the 3-year blip line. And it really wasn't until about 3 years after the stroke, and candidly, the event that I think triggered it was when, because of their policies at Sanford, Deb had been on medical leave from her job, but after 3 years, she had sort of maxed out the medical leave ability, and she had to give up her faculty position, her tenured position there. And that was really the trigger point to say, wait a minute, life as we know it is just going to be different. And that's what really started Deb on her kind of emotional journey around redefining herself. Who is she now that she can't do all the things she used to do? And that's what really led to the writing of the book, was the sense that through our path in the healthcare system, there really wasn't a lot of talk about this, encouragement to see counselors, to really think about your identity. And that became really the central part of Deb's journey. Mm-hmm. And as she talked to other stroke survivors at therapy groups, at support groups, it became very clear that many people were experiencing this same disconnect between what was really driving their life and their experience of life and the resources that were being offered to them to deal with it. And that's when Deb said, we need to somehow, figure out how I can write this book so that we can offer a resource to other people going through this.
Yeah.
It sounds like there's many layers to something like this. It's not like the cold or the flu. There's a significant shift in the way that her body worked, or her mind worked, or her ability to even function, right? Because you have one whole side of your body that's not working, as well as your voice. And I think not being able to speak after being a professor, especially when your communication is your key form, right? Being able to communicate your mind. So what did that emotional journey look like? And you're saying in about 3 years, you began to almost realize the reality. So what was that journey like for you, Debra, to just really kind of accept? How did you do that? And what did you do in your mind to kind of begin to turn your attention toward, how am I going to do this new normal?
3 years and a half, I am not really, I am really frustrated and not patient at all. And I would like to write a book, and I'd like to it's really not fair.
Now, Debra, were you able to speak at that point, or were you still unable to speak at 3.5 years after the stroke?
Yes, and it's really little.
Okay.
Yeah, at 3.5 years, it was dramatically better than immediately after the stroke, but not as good as it is now. Yeah. She's continued to improve. I mean, that's actually, just a little side note, one of the things you hear a lot in the world of stroke recovery is that most of the recovery happens within 6 to 12 months. And after that, the brain can't continue to improve. And Deb's experience, and the experience of almost every one of the people we interviewed for the book, is that's just not true. Yeah. And I think that's a place where, again, we hope to be able to influence how the medical profession is used. There's no question that the improvement, the rate of improvement declines, but that there is still the ability to improve. But I think, for Deb and for us, the writing of the book was actually integral to Deb's journey as an academic. One of the ways you kind of move forward is try to understand better and ask questions. So the writing of the book and interviewing other people was all part of Deb's journey to kind of come to grips with, okay, what is this? How am I going to deal with it? How do you deal with it effectively? And I think, one of the core messages of the book, and it is not easy, and Deb and we still struggle with this to this day, 9 years later, is sort of the notion of looking forward, not back.
Yeah.
That it's so easy when you lose capabilities to constantly be comparing your experience in the moment to what it would have been like in the past. And that's just not very helpful, because it's not reality, and there's no way to go back. And the question is, how do you look forward and say, okay, if this is my starting point, how can I build that life that I will enjoy, that I will find purpose, that I can be productive? And that, I think, is a big part of what Deb was, in effect, trying to teach herself to do in her new world by writing the book and saying, I can't be a professor in the classroom at Stanford anymore, but I want to create knowledge. I want to share that knowledge. How can I do that? And this book became her purpose. Yeah. So it's a different kind of career, but in effect, she's rebuilt her career around her current situation. Yeah.
Yeah. And I like to exercise. I have Steve and I are tandem biking and kayaking and sailing and skiing.
Yeah, so I mean, there's the professional side, and then there's the recreation and physical activity side. And again, early on, Deb was super upset that she couldn't run anymore, that she couldn't bike anymore. And so we tried to use those lessons of looking forward and saying, okay, well, let's find ways to exercise that work. And candidly, she wasn't, anybody who knows Deb knows she likes to have control. Yeah. So the idea of being on the back of a tandem where she couldn't steer and couldn't, and just had to look at my back, initially she wasn't wild about the idea, but when we figured out we could create a brace to support her arm that still isn't working fully, and she could get her heart rate up and get out there and do miles in a different way, that's become our new normal. And that's how we bike. So it's a lot of things like that, that I think if you're looking forward, you can find, whereas if you're looking back, it just, you don't create those new opportunities.
That's a very powerful point. I hear you saying things like new normal and not living with your eyes in the rearview mirror. Just figuring out how can you create that new quality of life, as if that old quality of life wasn't the only kind of quality that existed. It was the one you knew, it was the reality. But when reality shifted, it sounds like part of that emotional journey is really accepting the loss, right? But finding hope for what can be.
Yes, I agree.
And it's interesting that you word it that way, which is spot on. One of the chapters in the book is about grief and, the experience of losing a loved one and acceptance and, not necessarily getting, kind of getting over it. You never get over the loss of a loved one, but you want to get past it and accept it. And then what are you going to do? And we actually found a lot of similarities between, that in effect, Deb and I and our kids were grieving the loss of the old Deb. Yeah. And so the parallel is pretty direct. And yet, interestingly, the first thing that somebody says when they know you've lost a loved one is, have you seen a grief counselor? In the stroke world, that's not a common suggestion. And that's a big part of what identity theft, rediscovering ourselves after stroke is about, is that the survivor, the survivor's family, the friends, and the medical system really should pay more attention to this emotional side of the journey that is recovery.
And Steve and I, not for profit, and Strokes Forward, and I'd like to the emotional side of the grief.
Yeah. So okay, so in recreating Deb's professional life, one of the things she decided she wanted to do was use this experience and the writing of the book as the launch pad to do advocacy, to try to promote a greater sense of the emotional journey. And so we've created a small nonprofit called Stroke Forward to do that. And, we're just in the process of getting it going, but all author proceeds from the book will go to help fund the activity of Stroke Forward. Deb and I are volunteers to it, but we hope if we can have the funding to build a small team and really try to make a difference using our story as the starting point.
Yeah.
It's fascinating to me that you talked about the grieving process, because I think sometimes it would be very easy to focus on the healing and the getting better. And I think that's where the emotional side sometimes gets lost, because we're so focused on the physical, right? The obvious thing in the room is Debra's body has changed. Debra's not able to speak. Debra's not able to move. And now we have to figure out how she's going to engage with the physical world. But as with anything else, there's always emotional layers to what we're going through. And I do want to touch on a little bit the emotional journey for your family, because I know, having lost family members, everyone grieves so differently. So not only is there the grieving process, but now there's the how do we grieve together and not allow our individual styles of grief to create more stress? How do we grieve together separately? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, total.
Yeah. So how was that journey for you as a family? Because you have 3 children, right? Total. So there's 5 of you in your family.
Yes. And my mom too. Danny is the first. No, Sarah is the chapter 9. Sarah is 4 pages of high school chalk.
Well,
Yeah.
So chapter 9 of the book is called Stroke is a Family Disease.
Okay.
And that is your observations are spot on. And that chapter starts with a talk our daughter gave her senior year in high school, 2 years after Deb's stroke, looking back on the first weeks after the stroke and the impact it had on her. And in particular, she saw her mom appropriately as this role model of independence and strength and, can gut it out and do it herself. And how she started the grieving process very much the same way of, I can do this, I don't need help, but then started to see how Deb was allowing people to help her, and then started letting her friends in, and how she learned what that strength really means, being able to be vulnerable. And, candidly, we sat there listening to her give that talk and went through about 3 boxes of tissues.
I know. I'm actually tearing up thinking about it. And I didn't even hear the speech. My goodness. I think the power of a motherhood, though, it's true. We play a role. We fix, we facilitate, we provide, right? Whether it's emotional or physical. And so that power of recognizing strength is not always in pulling up your bootstraps and doing everything yourself. There's an inherent strength in, Debra, for you to recognize the power of community is now your new strength. Am I right?
Yes, really a lot.
And another chapter of the book is about support networks and using them. And if you aren't fortunate enough to have a strong support network, when you suffer a change like this, to build it. And that you can, even after a devastating stroke, there are ways to build a support network if you're not, we happen to be blessed with an amazing family and great friends that gave us the support we needed. But just back to our daughter's story. She's an athlete, and the closing line of her talk was, even the world's strongest person needs a spotter in the gym. It doesn't matter how strong you are. need help. And so that was pretty powerful for all of us.
And Adam, 3 days after, 3 days, I am Boston, rocking Adam's college.
Yeah, Deb's stroke literally was 2 days after she got back from Boston, where she dropped Adam off at his freshman year of college. And actually, we told the story last night. It's funny. So we let Adam know what was going on, and about 3 days later, he was able to catch a flight and come home, and he was in the hospital room with Deb. And at that point, Deb really didn't have much movement, reaction, no communication ability. And Adam, but we could tell she was hearing and understanding. And Adam said, Mom, I'm thinking about maybe stopping out and just coming home so I can support, and I can go back and start school in January or start school next year. And a look came over Deb's eyes that was just so clearly,
don't you dare.
I was going to use inappropriate language, but and it was actually an incredible moment, because it's what told us she was still there inside. She couldn't express it, but there was this just, nonverbal and not even, just in her eyes, we could all see it. And that was, that was a different experience. I think you talked about the family dynamic. We're all pretty lucky in that we're sort of an optimistic family. We tend toward the look forward, not back naturally. Yeah. So it's probably a little easier for us to do that. But our daughter also coined a phrase that we adopted, which was, no matter how much you look forward, you can't expect yourself to do it all the time. There's a lot about this situation that really stinks. Yeah. And you've got to give yourself the space to grieve that. And she came up with the expression pity party, that, you just sort of need to announce it so it doesn't drag you into a long-term negative place, but it gives you permission to be negative and griping and, being pissed off for a little while. And so she coined the phrase, what, let's just all have a pity party for a little while. And we'd talk about all that stinks and talk about all the great things we can't do together anymore. And I was like, okay, let's end this party. And that really helped us acknowledge the need to be negative, but hopefully do it in a way that didn't drag us there for a prolonged period of time. And so, you asked about family dynamics, and that was kind of one of the things that we sort of discovered as a family.
And I'm sure at different times, some people were up while other people were down, so you're kind of almost like pulling each other along through this journey. And I think it's interesting too, that you brought up the point, and your daughter pointed out, that it's okay in the grieving process, because part of the natural grieving process is anger. It is actually one of the steps of grieving, that you are going to feel angry about loss. Yeah. Loss is not something we naturally enjoy, And so it's interesting as you talk about the stroke journey. I think back to something I said and you said earlier about not recognizing the emotional side, or nobody's talking about the emotional side. And I'm wondering if it's because we are naturally inclined to just get back to status quo, right? Let's just get back to what it used to be, and then we'll just keep going. Yeah. But it sounds like your emotional journey as a family has really been grappling with the truth that it won't be the same. Yes, that sucks. But there has to be a tenacity to figure out what the beauty in the ashes is for your family. Mm-hmm. What is it going to look like to create a new normal? And I would think that would be a pretty powerful bonding experience for you as a family, to work together to create a new normal and to celebrate wins. How different that is for your children, Debra, to watch you learn again and to support you in a journey that you as a mom would naturally be the one doing.
Yes. and really a lot of I am really lucky, and my family is really lucky too.
Yeah, sounds like it. But I do think it's fantastic that you have that network. And as I was asking you about the power of community, if somebody doesn't happen to have that wonderful family community that you have, what kind of advice or direction would you give someone who doesn't have quite the same support within their home as they're navigating this emotional journey? What kind of community support would you encourage them to get?
And stroke support, and 2 chapters, friends and support networks.
Yeah, I mean, there are a growing number of organizations that provide gathering places for, and we've met some incredible people who have created some of these organizations, but support groups specifically around aphasia. Yeah. I think, the other thing we heard a lot in the people we talked to, the other survivors we talked to, is a lot of people turned to their faith and to organized religion and found really strong communities of support there.
Yes. Really a lot of community. Faith is really really a lot of survivors. Yeah. Faith is really a lot.
I think it's an anchor for a lot of people to have something to anchor it to, put some sense to the journey, I guess. When you think about friendships, did you find it that some people did not know how to walk that journey with you? Or did you have to kind of help people understand how to adjust? Or was that not a problem?
Really good friends, not at all. And academic friends, yes. I would like to really, I am not here. No, there.
Yeah, I think in some ways what we found is sort of the inner circle got tighter, the outer circle drifted more. And part of that was just the reality of a crazy life and more challenging communication, and just Deb's, in particular with her academic colleagues, leaving the world that created the natural interaction. But I think to the point of teaching, I actually, with aphasia, one of the very specific things is the tendency that people have to want to finish Deb's sentences, jump in. And even her best friends might go there. Yeah. And one of the very, very first expressions the speech therapist made sure Deb could say loud and clear was,
let me talk.
And at first she was reluctant to say it because it sort of felt obnoxious and like people were going to be offended. But what we found is people really appreciated it. They wanted to be able to support Deb effectively. And if they were doing something that was counterproductive, they felt horrible if Deb didn't say something.
And the academic friend, Robin and Joanne and Debbie, and really a lot of really meetings, really a lot of
close connections. Yeah, the academic friends in that inner circle of her friendships grew. But the people that she was friends, but more casual friends, more academic friends, again, no criticism of them or of Deb. It's just when life changes, where you spend your time changes.
Yeah.
And I think that was getting back to one of the core messages of the book, which is about identity, and really trying to say, for so long, Deb's identity was tied up in being a professor, being at Stanford. And I think if a big message of the book is, okay, you can grieve that and be angry about that, but what about being a professor? We talk about going to the core and what was really important about that, not the label, not the job, but the values and the purpose behind it. And that, I think, is really one of the things that we're trying to encourage, is think about those deeper meanings. And is there a way you can express that meaning in the face of new constraints?
As you're rebuilding your identity, you're basically looking for clues in what was happening before. Looking deeper below the surface and saying, what was it about that thing that I did that I loved? So you can figure out how to recreate it or reapply it to the new situation. Is that right?
Totally. And I think, to your audience and the message of your podcast, this is not just a stroke thing.
Yeah, I agree.
As we're out talking about the book, when we talk to a group of older people, and as we get older, what we think of as older keeps going up and up and up. But so many people come up to us and said, I haven't had a health trauma, but I can't do the things I used to do. Or, I chose to retire and I really wrestled with the loss of that identity. And the message of the book is really helpful for me to think about, okay, yep, that's true. I did lose that piece of my identity. What do I want to replace it with?
Yeah.
And that identity isn't this static thing, and it's not an internal personal thing. Your identity is in the context you're in. It's a social structure, and you have a lot of choice as to what you want it to be. And I think, that may be the broadest and most broadly applicable message.
And aging is really I really like it. YTO, the 30 people.
Yeah, we had the opportunity to talk to a group of about 15 business executives, former business executives who were in their sort of 60s to 70s, and many of them said that, again, without a health crisis, the ideas that you're bringing forth are really helpful to just thinking about this transition in my life from being somebody who was running an organization and, always in charge, and I'm voluntarily stepping back from that, but it's not easy. And I'm missing that identity. How do I rebuild it? So I think there are messages that could be more broadly helpful than just stroke survivors or survivors of other health crises.
Isn't it interesting? We just plug along in life being who we are, doing what we do. We don't necessarily engage that thought process because it's not being required of us. And I think in creating the Feminine Roadmap podcast, that was what was happening in my head, is there's some navigation tools that we need because things are happening. And yes, it is life. If you're going to say, well, that's life, that's all fine and wonderful, but we still have to live it, and we have to know how. And it's helpful if other people can lend a hand and say, look, this is my journey. This is how I navigated this difficulty, this shift, this extra pressure. And so as you're talking about how your message is more global, which absolutely it is, how do you change identity? What were some of the things that you did as a couple and as a family to help reconnect to who Debra is? And Debra, you can answer this and you can answer it together, but what did that look like for you guys? How far into that journey were you able to really begin to apply, okay, what we can't do, but what can we do?
The athletics and biking and sailing and skiing and the book is look forward.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of it was how can we adapt? Like, what is it that Deb really enjoys that we really enjoy together? And how can we adapt those things? So, just one example we use a lot is we always loved to travel. And when we were in a new city, we'd love to just either jog or walk to explore the city. And while Deb is walking very comfortably now, she walks slowly. So you can't really cover the same terrain. And so we explored all kinds of different assistive devices that Deb could use. We tried kids' scooters. We tried all kinds of things and finally found, people probably have seen them, these knee scooters that people use when they have a broken foot or a broken ankle. And by using that, Deb could move around a city at about the same pace the rest of us walked. So we could go to a city on vacation together and walk 8 or 10 miles, which is kind of how we like to explore a city. I think maybe more, that's the sort of activity side. I like to talk about the fact that I think the actual writing of the book and how that evolved is a great sort of microcosm of Deb's experience. So when Deb first decided to write the book, it was largely about proving she could. It was kind of like wanting to be able to say, I'm back. And it had the early versions in her mind had a very much more academic tone to it because that was her background. Then as she got into it and started interviewing more people and talking to more people, she started to realize that coming to grips with her own situation, that the book would be more effective as a sharing stories book, not just her own, but other people's as well. And as she kind of got even further into it, it really took on the primary purpose of helping other people. And it helped Deb realize that that's what she loved about being a professor. She loved being able to create knowledge and share knowledge that helped other people. And that really writing a book to prove she was back had no interest to her anymore because she had reconnected with the underlying meaning and the core value of her identity. And so I think that process of how her view of the book changed with time is very much an example of the process that we're thinking people can go through to rebuild lives of meaning.
And Sally and I, Sally is a ghostwriter, and Sally, 3 years, 3 years, I and Sally handled, and Sally's first draft is not here.
Can I pick it up? Yeah, just so Sally's a woman. She's an author, ghostwriter, editor, and worked very closely with Deb for about 1.5 years, 2 years of the process, doing all the interviews, outlining the book.
3 years.
3 years?
Yeah.
She's a stickler for accuracy. And, sort of again, the idea of the book was evolving, and the first draft that was produced at the time sort of her contract and relationship was over, it had a lot of great stuff, but it didn't necessarily embody the core messages that had evolved to become most important to Deb.
Yeah.
And that's when, fortunately, our son Danny was in between jobs trying to figure out what he wanted to do next. And he volunteered to kind of step in and, if you will, take the pen and be the person to try to, because the writing process was mostly talking with Deb to make sure we knew what she wanted it to say, and then somebody else drafting, and then Deb not being bashful about telling us where we didn't capture it right. And Danny really became the person in that final push to be the primary penman, if you will, and thus the co-author on the book.
Wow, what a cool thing to have your son step in and be that for you. How was that for you, Debra?
Really, really great.
It was really great until he got a full-time job with a startup and started working 80 hours a week.
Yeah.
And then was a little less available to work on Deb's accelerated time frame.
And Danny is in New York.
And he's living during that process, decided to work in New York and moved to New York. So this book really has been a remotely produced team collaborative effort. And, that in and of itself is indicative of the new reality, that it's still Deb's message, it's still her voice, but getting that voice onto paper had to be different than it would have been, or than it was when she wrote her first book called Tempered Radicals 18 years ago.
Yeah.
And it's just is different.
I was wondering, as you're talking about writing this book and the extended journey, we'll call it, the time frame may not have been Debra's favorite time frame. I feel like Debra and I are kindred spirits in time frames. Let's get this thing done, right?
Yeah.
So I totally feel that. How did writing this book, Debra, contribute to your healing process or your growth process it's because healing is continual for you, right? You're growing and learning. So how did writing the book contribute to that?
Really a lot. I still have things to say, and really it's growth and meaning is really a good deal.
Big deal.
So that growth, it brought back meaning. Basically, you're the voice that got lost. The book gave you that voice. Is that right?
Yes.
How did that help your mental frame? Did it help you feel more yourself?
No. No, it's yes and no. The phrase is really difficult to communicate, and yes, I am back.
Yeah, back in a different way.
Yeah.
And being able to communicate your thoughts and probably your giftedness as a teacher.
Yeah.
Did writing the book help you see that you still have that gift?
Yes, really a lot. It's really a lot.
And that must be for you, Debra, to be able to find a way to have that joy again.
Yes. And it's I am not shy about the journey, and I am laughing a lot. Really a lot more. Yeah.
Are you having more joy?
Yes.
Yeah. Good. It's, it's an interesting thing. I think people fall on different sides of this kind of an experience, You either stay stuck, like Steve, you were talking about earlier, just staying stuck in the grief, and the pity party and the suck of it all. But I think there's always beauty in ashes. And if we are engaging a process that's not easy, we can find those treasures, right? You have to dig a little, but the joy, it's difficult in the journey, right? To lose something, but in the digging and finding the treasure, was the book part of that treasure for you?
Yes. And 8 years ago, Robin and I am going to melodic intonation therapy in Boston, and one day a week.
Once a day?
No, once a day. And really a lot of joy.
Oh, in terms of your relationship with Robin?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think what Deb is saying, about a year after the stroke, she had the opportunity to be in a clinical trial for an innovative form of speech therapy called melodic intonation therapy. And it entailed about 4 months of daily therapy sessions in Boston. And Deb moved to Boston for the better part of 4 months and lived in a spare room of a very close friend and a woman who's a professor at Harvard Business School named Robin Ely. And they had been colleagues and friends and co-authors, but, kind of one of those, we call them silver linings, was her ability to develop, in a sense, a new and different relationship with Robin, living with Robin and her husband and their daughter, who was still at home, and really getting to know each other in a different way, as well as Deb being in a different place. And we talk all the time. It was very hard for Deb to acknowledge silver linings early on, because there was this sense that if you're admitting there's anything good out of this shitty situation, you're somehow saying the situation isn't so bad. But I think one of the things, and we try to bring this out in the book, is recognizing, acknowledging, and celebrating those silver linings is really important. And it doesn't mean you're glad it happened, and it doesn't mean you'd do it again if you had the choice. But in that process of rebuilding a life of joy and meaning, you're effectively stealing yourself of an opportunity and almost forcing yourself to look backwards if you don't acknowledge and appreciate and celebrate those things that are good, those gems in the ashes. And so I think that's another piece of the message that we hope might help other people as well.
It sounds like you have you've developed the ability to live in 2 lifetimes. You've got your past life, and you're gleaning from that, and you're rebuilding a new life. So it sounds like there's kind of a marriage of the two, like you said. You're aware of the past life, but you're kind of hunting for those clues or those things that you can bring forward to almost become like the framework of the new life, but you're not rebuilding the same life.
It's trying to anchor on what's most important and building that in. And I actually think that's where this message is so broadly relevant, because even before Deb's stroke, there were ways in which we had kind of lived our lives in chapters where we've said, okay, for this 10 or 15 years, this is what we're focused on. And, I made a major career change. That was a change in chapter. It wasn't brought on by a need, but fortunately kind of a decision to change direction a little bit. And I think that's where I think for a lot of people, thinking about those changes in the context of their identity and what is really most important to them at the core, and choosing to build an identity which helps them make choices around change that allows them as a person to be in alignment. You know, what they're doing is aligned with what they value, which is aligned with how they see themselves, which is kind of your identity. And so, you know, that's a choice everybody can make every day.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people have a hard time making it.
Yeah.
But it can be rewarding.
Yeah. And
Did you have something you wanted to add to that, Debra?
No, yes. I am still a Sanford adjunct professor in Sanford. I am still office there.
Yeah, Deb did realize that having a connection to the university was important to her. And the question then was to say, okay, I can't have the same kind of connection I had before, but is there a connection I can have so that I can still enjoy that piece of that community that I can still add to and benefit from?
And Clayman Institute and gender, I really, a lot of people, I once a week, I have the lunch, the Clayman Institute, gender.
Yeah, so there's a center at Stanford called the Clayman Institute that's a center on gender. And that's one of the places where Deb realized that connection, because of her history as a diversity scholar and all the strong feelings she has about the need for work in that arena, was a place where she worked particularly hard to maintain a connection and stay involved. So again, it's in some ways that you could say the stroke was a gift that forced Deb and us to focus in on what's really most important to us. Whereas in the ordinary course of life, as you were saying before, you often just get caught up putting one foot in front of the other, and because you did it in the past, you do it in the future. Very often it's hard, and there's no impetus to really ask those deep questions. So, you know, in that sense, it was sort of a wake-up call that said, hey, let's really figure out what's most important and how we can rebuild that into a different life.
Yeah.
When you talk about this life, what I'm hearing, I'm just sharing with you my perspective, is that the fact that you acknowledge that it's a gift because it shifted your perspective is what I'm appreciating about the story. Because so often life has so many distractions, right? There's things we need to do, things we want to do, and then sometimes we don't do them because we don't feel like it. But when something traumatic happens, if we lean into the trauma, it can have a clarifying ability.
Yeah,
I agree.
And in Deb's case, it was by necessity. You know, that even if she decided that everything she was doing before the stroke was a good expression of her deepest concerns and values, they weren't available anymore. But by focusing on what those deeper meanings were, she could free herself up to mourn less and create more, to sort of say, okay, now that I know what's really important to me, let's figure out how to build as much of that as possible into the life that includes speech constraints and physical constraints.
I love that. Mourn less, create more. Really continuing to move through that grieving process. Does the grieving process still exist on some levels? Do you find that there's different iterations of the grief process as you go along?
I am frustrated more than it used to be. 5 times I have frustrated every day.
Yeah.
It's really not one hand, and my leg is not working, and speech is really a problem.
Yeah, no, I think the answer to that question is a resounding yes.
Yeah.
And I think, that's where we try to get back to the pity party and say, we have to give ourselves permission to acknowledge that for the rest of our lives, there will be elements of the future we had envisioned for ourselves that will never be available to us. And, I would say it's not human to think you're never going to think about that and regret that. It's trying not to let that weigh us down
and become your identity, the bitter, resentful folks. If you were to really kind of think about what would be 3 things, maybe 3, if you have 4, that's fine, that you would want people to take away from this message, because obviously going out and getting a copy of the book, Identity Theft, for anyone who's going through a difficult health transition or trying to help a family member navigate some kind of traumatic change, is one of those steps. But in your own life journey together, what would be 3 things that you would love people to really grasp and walk away with?
The audiobook is available.
Okay, good. So it's also on audio.
Yes.
But that's not one of the 3.
No.
No, but that's good to know, because I'll definitely be putting links in the show notes so that people can get to these things quickly.
Yeah.
Excellent.
And look forward, not back. Small, focusing on small wins. Growth is really a part of this.
That and there's a book called Option B that talks about post-traumatic growth, and that that you really can grow through a situation like this, and by focusing on that growth, that's a really, really helpful strategy for looking forward, not back.
Yeah. And meaning.
Focus on the deeper meaning.
Yes.
Mm.
And I guess the one, if I can, that I would add, or maybe, one to people who are engaged in stroke specifically, is the notion that, again, it's not all the emotional journey. The physical part is important, and it's hard work. And Deb often describes the first 1.5 or 2 after her stroke as the hardest full-time job she ever had. But that you can continue to improve long after the 12 months that the medical system and, candidly, the insurance system often tries to convince you is sort of the natural limit on recovery from stroke. So for the stroke world specifically, I think that's one of the messages we hope people hear.
And that's important to understand, and that's where your story is so important for people to hear. And I know as you talk about growth, I want to end on this point. There's got to be maybe a potential for a paradigm shift in what growth looks like and the speed at which we grow. Would that be true? Like when you're going through stroke recovery, you are growing, but you have to kind of wrap your mind around what that growth looks like and how long it actually takes.
Yeah.
And that, the recovery, people use the word recovery very often, that immediately brings the mindset to recovering physical capabilities or recovering speech. And what we often talk about now is recovery really is recovering a life of joy and meaning. And that's what real recovery is, because if you set yourself up to define recovery only as the recovery of capabilities, for a lot of people, it's just not possible to recover all those capabilities. And so if you set your definition that way, you're effectively saying that person cannot recover.
Yeah.
And we don't think that's a healthy mindset, because everybody can recover from a disaster. It's just a question of what that recovery looks like. Yeah. And so it's really putting the focus on rebuilding a life of joy, meaning, purpose, whatever's important to the individual.
And stroke, everyone is different. Really, a lot. Really, it's really everyone is different.
Yeah. And that plays into Deb's background as a diversity scholar, that we have a line in the book that says every person is different, every stroke is different, and every recovery is different. And it's so easy, and Deb fell into this trap a lot of, seeing another stroke survivor progressing faster with their physical recovery. The reality is, a millimeter to the left or a millimeter to the right, where the damage to your brain can be the difference between permanent paralysis and full recovery. Yeah. And so it's just, you can't measure it against other people's experience. And it's not just the physical side. It's, we all have different, we talked earlier, we are particularly lucky with an incredible support network, access to, we had great insurance, access to great medical care. A lot of the stroke survivors Deb talked to for the book didn't have that. Yeah. So their experience is going to be very different than our experience.
So before we wrap up, I do want to touch on your nonprofit, Stroke Forward. So, what is it and how can people support it?
Great. Okay, if I take this one, Deb?
Yeah.
So what it is still an evolution, but very specifically, we want to be able to try to spread the message of the book and the message of our journey to try to support other stroke survivors of other traumas, and people generally with this notion of attention to identity and rebuilding identity as a path to creating more joyful, productive, meaningful lives. So that really is the primary purpose. And there will be some focus specifically on the healthcare system and trying to get the healthcare system to focus on that more. So that really is why we're building Stroke Forward. In terms of helping, if folks want to go to the website, you can support it if you'd like with money. We'll also be, over time, building a community, sign up for mailing lists so that we can engage people on issues that we find to be particularly important to doing the work of the organization.
Awesome. Debra, did you have anything to add to that? It looks like you had something.
Emotional and psychological.
Yeah, really focusing on the emotional and psychological component of recovery from any health trauma.
That's an important thing to remember. And I do want to thank you, Debra, and I want to thank you, Steve, for coming on to the podcast, for sharing your journey and your story, because I do believe that what you're doing is revolutionary. It's shifting the paradigm away from what most people think, I got to fix this body, and you're taking it to all the layers of who we are and how we can show up in the world in spite of trauma. And I think that's a very hopeful message.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
It is completely my pleasure. So today I've been talking with Debra Meyerson. She's a former Sanford professor, although she is an adjunct professor still. She has written the book with her son, Danny, Identity Theft, Rediscovering Ourselves After Stroke. And I've also been talking with her husband, Steve Zuckerman. And if you want to get a copy of this book, please head over to my website at www.feminineroadmap.com/episode 110, where I will have links to their book, to them, and to their nonprofit. I do want to encourage you to share this message with anyone that you know of that is going through something similar, and share this gift of life with them. As always, while you're at the website, please leave your name and email address to join my tribe. I have a special gift for you. You can listen to this podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Spotify, Podbean, and Stitcher. I want to remind you that these messages are meant for you. If you're listening to this message, there's something in it for you. And recovering a life of purpose at any stage that you're going through, my friends, remember that recovery is finding a life of joy and meaning. That is really what recovery is. So don't lose hope. Dig in and find that thing that you love to do and be, and find a way to show up in the world. I want to thank you for joining us today, and I look forward to talking with you all again next week. Take care. Bye-bye.